So April Alliston, who is with the Department of Comparative Literature at Princeton University, who's the author, most notably, of Virtue's Faults, Correspondences in 18th Century British and French Women's Fiction. And I'm going to keep the introductions brief, there's more to say, but who will speak today on the concept everyone's been waiting for, which is pornography.
Okay, so it falls to me to define pornography, which no one has ever been able to define since people started trying about 250 years ago, when Rousseau, I think, was the first to attempt it when he was casting about for Le Mot Juste in his Confessions. Just had to say, you know, those books one reads with one hand, because the term pornography did not, in fact, exist when he wrote that in around 1764, and all the way down to 200 years later when Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart made his famous definition, "I know it when I see it." But actually, I think Akil has helped me surprisingly in this daunting task. We didn't consult beforehand, but as you'll see, in fact, my as I forge ahead boldly, my definition of pornography that I'm going to work up to emerges entirely out of this irreconcilable conflict between liberty and equality, and how that's implicated in the use of property. And so I think that your idea of the unalienated life must hold the answer somewhere, but I'm just still, I'm hoping that Akil and everybody else here may help me figure that out. So I actually gave a TED talk on this concept definition of pornography, but this format and this audience are about as different from that as could possibly be. There I had to memorize every single word, I had pictures. This is going to be a little more informal and much more intellectual. I actually wasn't allowed to mention feminism or Lacan in my TED talk. It was brutal censorship. Okay, so I could actually take more time than I have just going over other people's past attempts to define pornography. Instead of doing that, I will start with why I think it's a political concept and why I find it politically important to make this effort again, now that we're in the era of internet porn. So I don't have time to really remind you all, but I'm sure a lot of people are aware that at the end of the last millennium, we had the porn wars, and then the internet came, and there was just porn. All feminist critiques seem to fall silent for decades. Even the analysis of the self-identified sex-positive feminists, they fell silent too. And by the way, although I consider myself sex-positive, I find that term sex-positive feminist kind of like pro-life. Like the implication is that the rest of us aren't in favor of life or sex, and I kind of resent that. But anyway, they too fell silent in the face of in these sort of firestorm, if you will, of internet pornography. Even though because of that, there's been so much more to talk about, and specifically not just more pornography in the world, but it has so pervaded our culture and consciousness much more than ever before. To give you an example, one of the so-called sex-positive feminists, Katie Roiphe, wrote in 1993, dissing Catherine McKinnon, which was their favorite thing to do. She said, Catherine McKinnon endows the porn industry with more power than most of us going about our lives relatively uninterested in pornography tend to grant it. Yeah, those were the days when, in fact, one could go around being, feeling like one was untouched by porn. That has all changed. The much more intelligent, sex-positive critic of pornography, Linda Williams, wrote in 1989, even though the definition and history of pornography are elusive, she also remarked, there's remarkable consensus concerning the need to include power as the significant new term in their formulation, that is, in the formulation of a definition of pornography. She wrote that in her the book that put her on the map, Hardcore, in 1989. But now with the pervasiveness of porn in cyberspace, where it's everywhere and nowhere at the same time, it's not on 42nd Street, it's not in your video shop, it's everywhere, nowhere. It's somehow become also everything, and yet nothing, at the same time, nothing that we can actually talk about or analyze or critique in terms of its relationship to power, as Linda Williams called for. This has become so true that we now, in sort of Umgangssprache, in daily parlance, we tend to speak about any glossy images from which we feel we may be deriving some kind of guilty or cheap pleasure. We tend to call all of those porn, like we talk about food porn, real estate porn, etc. But this just, of course, muddles the concept and makes it even harder to talk about it in terms of power or analyze it in any way. For similar reasons, because of the pervasiveness of pornography via the internet, porn culture is now a thing. It's a phrase seen regularly in places like the New Yorker and the New York Times. Porn culture is about what exceeds representation. It's not just pornography itself. It talks about how the culture of pornography exceeds pornography as representation and starts to articulate gendered social interactions well beyond any sexual intercourse itself. Porn culture I think, conveys the idea that what used to be specific to pornography has so pervaded our general culture that it now just seems normal or better visible. What motivates me to try to redefine and reconceptualize pornography in the internet age is to make it visible, to make it possible to talk about it and discuss it, and I hope that by doing this, that some collective action, or perhaps better, some networked action might be possible that could, as I said in my TED Talk, disrupt porn culture without censoring pornography. Specifically, porn culture, this is one of many concerns, but I think it's especially apropos here. Porn culture is notably affecting college campus culture in ways that draw, or make it possible to draw, a clear connection between porn culture and another catchphrase that's been surfacing a lot lately. I think it began in the title of a film in 1970 called Rape Culture. But it's resurfaced a lot recently with Steubenville and lots of other incidents where rape culture, meaning the idea that we're now in a culture where rape is regularly publicly advocated and joked about, to some extent promoted, and treated as a kind of acceptable community standard, even if it's not actually being perpetrated at that moment. Some examples from campus culture are pretty well known, that at Yale in 2010 on the freshman campus, members of a fraternity chanted, "No means yes, yes means anal." More recently, just this summer, there were several incidents in Canada, one at St. Mary's University, where at a student-run freshman orientation, the older students made everybody chant a verse based on the word young, because the freshmen, of course, were young, often under 18 even. Young, why young? Oh, on your knees, you underage, and no consent, gee, grab that ass. These kind of things, these are just two examples of many, many similar kinds of incidents in campus culture. So if you've watched any internet porn at all, and it's almost impossible to avoid that, it's pretty obvious where this kind of stuff comes from. It's not, anal sex is not new, rape is not new, the idea of non-consent is not new, but it is pretty new that this be so culturally acceptable in a way, and widespread, sort of say it publicly like that. So lest you're alarmed that I might be about to say that porn causes rape, I am not going to do that. That argument was oversimplified, it was overly positivistic, it proved itself unsustainable, but it did, I think, involve an insight into a relationship which I think the virtual reality of internet porn has made clearer what that relationship could be. It's not that porn causes rape, but I do think that porn culture and rape culture are mutually implicated. So my hope is that my definition might inspire at least more open discussion and critique, if not collected or perhaps discrete but networked action to disturb that trend, which disturbs me as an educator, a feminist, and a sexual being. So if porn is now everything and nothing, the problem is to define its specificity. Everybody who's tried to do that speaks, most of them anyway, tend to speak of the difference between pornography and erotica. And I'm going to do the same thing, but I think I'm going to arrive at a different definition, and I'm doing it to a somewhat different political end, and definitely in a different context, that of cyberspace and internet porn. I think, so to begin, I think any critical definition has to historicize, because ahistoricity is a way of resisting specificity and tends to create the illusion of the natural and the timeless, which is especially rampant in talk about porn. It's very common to say porn's been around forever, since the days of the caveman. Totally not true. Yes, indeed, a little caveat, the concept of pornography, like most complex ideas, is protean and fragile, to use a phrase used yesterday. But I see my attempt to pin it down not as definitive, but as a kind of political tool that could be used to specific ends. Okay, so most people who try to define pornography go to the Greek etymology, pornos for prostitute, grapheme for to write or to draw. But surprisingly, nobody except the Oxford Classical Dictionary points out that there was no such Greek word in ancient Greece. And I quote the dictionary, in antiquity, the rare term pornographos is used in a far more limited sense to mean a writer about or painter of whores. So it's not even a genre, it's a person who writes about or draws whores. The lost, they're not even extant, okay? The lost Hellenistic erotic handbooks, probably written by men, despite being assigned to female authors, suggest that part of their purpose was to teach women to be whores, presenting themselves as objects for male pleasure. So that was the quote from the Oxford Classical Dictionary. And I would contend that teaching women to be whores is, in a very general sense, still the function of pornography. And I would have to add, very importantly, also to teach men to be Johns. And that's why in the age of porn culture, we have adolescent girls offering $5 blowjobs in high school restrooms. That's not a rarity, that's shockingly frequent. But this word, it's important to remember that this word and this idea barely even existed in ancient Greece. They just had erotica, a Greek word meaning anything that relates to desire. Still, you can see in this rare term pornographos, the inkling that's taken up much later by the early modern tradition, where, again, male authors ventriloquize of female desire, supposedly to be trained into prostitution. So it's a very modern concept. It develops very slowly and gradually in early modern Europe, mainly as anti-clerical satire. The first images to be viewed, to be considered pornographic, were censored by Pope Clement III in the 16th century. These were followed by a couple of texts. There were like literally 2 works in the 17th century that sort of followed this model of schools for whores. It was a very slow development until the era of Rousseau, the 1760s, when he's casting about for that term, that mot-juste that doesn't yet exist. Somebody came up with it for him, Rétif de la Bretonne, who was also writing in the 1760s, a few years after Rousseau seems to have written the Confessions. And Rétif revives this term pornographos to write a book with that title, which literally, the pornograph, which literally is about establishing state-run whorehouses in Paris. It's not, Rétif did write some what we would call pornographic works, but this is not one of them. This is like a bureaucratic handbook, pretty much, how a brothel should be run. So I'll skip over that and go straight to the Marquis de Sade. Because historians of porn, just take my word for it, most historians of pornography agree, there's a surprising amount of agreement that the Marquis de Sade is the father of modern pornography. That is, as a concept distinguishable from erotica. So he's where to look for the historical development of the genre. But they don't agree on why he is. Robert Darnton, for example, says that sods are the first material that's not primarily, first sort of body material that's not primarily political critique or lampoon, and seems rather primarily about producing an affective response of arousal. Steintrager, who's a critic of French libertine literature, claims that Sade's the first to separate out pleasure alone, as he calls it, from sentiment or social relevance, with which Retief wanted to combine those. They were rivals, Sade and Retief, a lot of the time. They had very opposite views of what erotic literature should look like. And in fact, Sade is a very complex figure, much more complex than any earlier body material. And part of that complexity, Steintrager pins down with the phrase Sade's proto-feminist misogyny. Similarly, Linda Williams, who writes so intelligently for a sympathetic view of hardcore pornography right before the internet, Linda Williams writes, Angela Carter argues in favor of pornography not on aesthetic grounds, but on the value of Sade's politicization of sexuality and on his insistence on the right of women to fuck as aggressively, tyrannically, and cruelly as men. I'm indebted to these insights into Sade's importance and complexity, but they still don't get at the crux of the political concept of pornography. I would locate that rather in Sade's innovative usage of the term jouissance. In the neoclassical Enlightenment tradition, very much within it, Sade imagines, like Retief, mammoth temples of Venus or state-run brothels in Paris. Pornography is always about not just training women to be whores and men to be Johns, but about organizing, containing, and managing a sexuality that's hierarchized in terms of gender and economics. Sade and Retief both wanted to build bricks and mortar brothels in Paris, but we've now privatized that function of education and hygiene and built them in cyberspace, where they could be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. But to return to Sade. Despite what Darnton says about Sade being more about arousal than politics, I think with Angela Carter that he's very much just as much about political satire as he is about arousal. And the way the satire is in that he pushes that famous slogan of the French Revolution, which is when he's writing, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, he pushes that to its most radical and thus illogical extreme. You could say he was the first Tea Partier at the time of the actual Boston Tea Party. And he believed very much in the equal liberty of all brothers to tyrannize each other. And because it's a radically private and personal liberty that Sade favors, it's always sexualized. Sade writes, incest should be the law of any government based on fraternity. And he further mocks the idea of fraternity by extending liberty to women, not just brothers. He abolishes marriage as a form of female slavery, but he abolishes rape at the same time because, like most men of his age, he can only understand rape as a violation of property rights. Beyond these historical blind spots, which he might be able to forgive Sade, his apparent proto-feminism still privileges fraternity very starkly. He argues that once women are freed from the exclusive control of one man in wedlock, their freedom should consist in being legally required to render up the use of their bodies to any and all men who wish it, whenever they wish it. And his way out of the apparent contradiction is, in fact, his use of the legal term in French, jouissance, which is enjoyment in English. He writes, let it not be said that I contradict myself, in that having established above that we have no right to bind a woman to ourselves, I have abolished that principle by saying now that we have the right to force her. I repeat that this is only about use, jouissance, and not property. I have no right to real property in this or that woman, but I have incontestable rights to enjoy the use of her, and to force her to that use if she refuses me for any reason whatsoever. Jouissance is the legal term enjoyment in English, the right to enjoy an unhindered use of property, whether it's one's own real property or only usufruct. It wasn't until after Sade, but very shortly after Sade, that jouissance also comes to mean orgasm in French, or sensual enjoyment. And this is, of course, the sense that Lacan later ran with, but I'll get to that in a little while. So focusing only on let's see, focusing only on those very few passages where Sade announces that those who focus on his declaration of the rights of women to fuck others to the extent that the very rigid power structure allows it, that those people who like to focus on, in other words, Sade's privileging of women to be tyrants too, they miss the rigid hierarchy of gendered and economic power that Sade inscribes into the very order of nature, and which in my view is what makes him the inventor of both modern pornography and jouissance in the more Lacanian sense or modern sense of also orgasm, pleasure, the desire of the other. Sade's original mutual implication of the idea of orgasm with the idea of usufruct, that's original with Sade, and his inscription of that within a naturalized power hierarchy, I would argue is at the basis of pornography as distinct from the much longer and much more widespread tradition of erotica. And I say that because pornography and sadomasochism are both Western European ideas. They're exported elsewhere later. But anyway, Sade dreamed up everything that's on the internet all by himself. He thought of it all, and he's certainly not heteronormative. For example, one of his famous protagonists says to the ingenue who's begging him to fuck her, he says, "My dear, I never fucked a cunt in my life, and I can't violate my principles now." His temples of Venus that he proposes offer all sexes, all ages, and all creatures, and all acts to the customer. So there's nothing heteronormative about Sade. And yet this freedom and polyvalence is all inscribed within a very rigidly gendered hierarchy. And this remains, I think, the paradox of pornography to our own day. It can be very varied in its offerings, and yet it's still, I think, all inscribed within this rigidly gendered hierarchy. So my distinction of pornography from the ancient and vast plurality of erotica, my distinction would turn not on aesthetic value, not on social relevance, not on the level of explicitness, these are all yardsticks that have been used in the past, not on community standards, which is the most prevalent legal term nowadays, decorum, local decorum about obscenity, not on the affective or arousal response, not on the male gaze or objectification, in the sense of denial of women's agency or their desire or pleasure or humanity, but instead on the mutual implication of the concepts of pleasure and use, which starts with Sade, and which entails an inscription of an imbalance of political and economic power into the natural order, or at least the sexual order in the body. There's no mutual recognition in this system, to go back to what Paul Kaufman was saying yesterday. There's no trust, to go back to what Jay Bernstein was saying. And most importantly, there's no consent. But I think what Akhil was saying about consent is helpful. It doesn't, when I say there's no consent involved, I'm not saying, even though Sade advocates rape or doesn't even recognize it as thinkable, I'm not saying that I think all pornography is about rape by any means. Rather, it's about use of a kind that makes consent beside the point. Or better, to try to begin to work with what Akhil was just saying about consent. The allegations of consent with regard to pornography, and I think prostitution too, is about introducing this implied consent fraudulently, which would not have been given if there was an economic equality in the world. Just as a footnote to that, though, I find it interesting that BDSM culture, which Sade also crystallized out of elements that were beginning to circulate in 18th century Europe, is more than any other current sexual subculture all about defining limits of consent. However, I'm not sure whether or not that's true of BDSM porn, as opposed to actual sexual practice. Because I'm interested in mainstream porn culture. My research has focused entirely on mainstream porn, or what Williams calls mainstream hardcore porn, and what Zizek calls standard heterosexual porn. It is in fact an industry standard, I think, for all sorts of other kinds of porn. To say that pornography eroticizes use is not at all the same as to say that it objectifies women. Here's Zizek's latest response to that rather outdated argument. This was just published a few months ago. I absolutely disagree with Laura Mulvey, the cinema theorist, that in heterosexual pornography, the woman is reduced to the object of the male gaze. Not at all. Do you notice how the woman being fucked is allowed to break the basic rule of fiction movies and look directly into the camera? Men, no. You don't identify with the man fucking the woman. He is a pure instrument. If you're a hetero guy observing a hardcore movie, what you're looking for, and this is signaled to you by the woman, is some confirmation that the woman really enjoys it. The true object is the poor guy, usually some sailor fucking her, which is why the woman, as a rule, has to make all those sounds all the time. Yes, I would agree the poor guy is absolutely just as dehumanized as the woman, but that doesn't make it better. That's part of the problem. On the other hand, there's still a gendered power imbalance that in that Zizek uses Lacan's theory of jouissance to gloss over. For a more academic audience, somewhat before he published that, Zizek used the same example to say that desire, as per Lacan, desire is not desire for an object, but desire for the other's desire. And these expressions and sounds that the porn actress makes prove that porn is really about that, the other's desire. I think the problem with this analysis is that hetero porn, in fact, makes the other's desire over into a desire to offer herself up as an object of male pleasure, to quote the Oxford Classical Dictionary again. Linda Williams on heterosexual porn describes, quote, the genre's frequent insistence that this visual confession of a solitary male truth, by which she means the money shot, the external ejaculation, coincides with the orgasmic bliss of the female. Such is, of course, the concept of deep throat, where the clitoris is located in the throat, so that the fantasy is that the female desire and pleasure consists precisely in acts that would bring a male to orgasm, but would never physically bring a woman to orgasm. And that's where that fantasy of deep throat and of most heterosexual pornography, if not most pornography, is where Sadian jouissance and Lacanian jouissance coincide. That is, the desire for the other's desire is signified as the male orgasm achieved through use and enjoyment of the other's body. So here's why I think my definition is useful. I hope it allows resistance to the power structures of pornography, because it refuses to confuse pornography with just any and all sexually explicit material, let alone any and all pleasurable material. And thus it avoids the logical and political trap of arguments around censorship and freedom of speech. Censorship, in fact, generates pornography, and moreover, pornography is censorship, in that it censors the freedom of imagination by replacing both experience and fantasy with a commodified virtual reality. I think I have to agree with Zizek in this respect. In that same article I just quoted, he says that the second aspect of censorship in pornography I noticed when I was young, when I saw my first hardcore movies. Then he talks about how stupid the story is and how you can't really believe it. And then he said, and then it came to me, Zizek writes, my God, they can't be that stupid. This is censorship. The idea is you can either be totally emotionally identified, as in mainstream films, and then you don't see sex at all, or you see it all the details in porn films, but then the story has to be ridiculous, so you shouldn't take it seriously. Now the censorship, Zizek continues, goes even further. He goes on to describe gonzo porn is when actors directly face the camera and say, am I doing this well, or should we do that, or this? And he says, no, I think precisely this is censorship. That is, the horror is that you would really fall into this story. It's spontaneous social censorship, but that's what makes it so much more mystical. There's no direct censor, and all the hardcore movies obey these rules. So the rigid codification of pornography is what I would agree with Zizek is a kind of spontaneous censorship. So I'm hoping that my distinction liberates an alternative category of erotica from this spontaneous social censorship of pornography. Erotica would not be less explicit or more aesthetic, just less commodified and less socially censored. And the sign of what is erotica is that it gets very explicitly and deliberately and systematically censored. Do I have time for an example or two? For example, there was a porn star called Madison Young who had pictures of herself taken in clothes when she had a baby, she had her picture taken clothed, nursing her infant, but she was vamped up, like sort of like a Marilyn Monroe lookalike. And this was actually censored by the porn industry. Like fellow porn workers said, you know, that's child abuse. Another example, there's this student magazine in Australia where about a dozen women on the editorial board just got sick of being made to feel like their private parts were dirty, so they made them public. They put pictures of their vulvas on the cover, and this was censored. So that's what I'm talking about by a kind of self-generated form of erotic material that does not fit within the censorship of pornography, I'm trying to advocate the promotion of that rather than the consumption, the sort of passive consumption of pornography. So I think, do I have another minute? No, I'm done? Okay, I'm done.
The question for Alliston is easy. I love the analysis. I think it's powerful and useful. And the idea of encouraging a different form of erotica, more than welcome. But it concedes everything to existing patriarchy. That is, there simply is no reason to think that everything that drives pornography at the moment, right, depends upon that unequal power. That is, depends on the culture of patriarchy above all. I can't see why the cultivation of erotic alternatives is anything but wishing for a different future. Maybe under the notion of reform rather than revolution, but I'm puzzled as a response to, as you rightly say, a growing problem in the sense that it's making life for women, especially obviously on college campuses, significantly worse. So that's my puzzle about your, unless there was some further political or legal thing you were suggesting at the end, which I didn't hear.
Okay, so Jay, are you saying that you're puzzled that I would propose some alternate form of erotic material as an antidote to pornography because there's no escape from the patriarchal structures anyway, or is that what you were saying?
It sounded like you were conceding defeat. You were offering an alternative, which would be welcome, but you were conceding the space because the drawing of the line gives us, you know, a way of drawing the line, but doesn't tell us what more humane culture, and you say what a more humane culture would be like, but the problem arises out of patriarchy. So the problem hasn't been shifted.
Well, if I knew how to get rid of patriarchy all at one go, I guess I would do it. But I mean, I can only conceive of, you know, the other proposals that have been made that I know about are either censorship, which doesn't work because censorship actually generates pornography, or there are proponents of what they call feminist pornography, and I think the reason, and I've read them, and I think the reason they want to call it pornography instead of, you know, making a distinction like I do, well, I don't think they say themselves, is because pornography is a multi-billion-dollar industry and they want to cash in, like all the guys, you know. Good, great. The only problem is that I didn't have time. I wanted to talk about the feminist pornographers actually, but I ran out of time. But they talk about their experience in the porn industry and how their ideals, of which I approve, of making something they call pornography that would be more like what I call erotica, that gets censored by the porn industry, duh. And one way it gets censored that I noticed, it's not the way they're talking about, but one way I noticed as a consumer rather than a producer was that, I only, because Princeton doesn't give me a very big research budget, I only looked at free porn on the internet. And there's tons of free porn. There's only two kinds of porn that you can't look at for free. And that is child pornography and pornography for women. And that's because it's obviously obvious why you can't see child pornography for free. Pornography for women because it doesn't sell, or at least the industry doesn't believe it sells well enough to give you these free enchantillons, as I like to call them, samples which are meant to enchant you and sort of draw you in as this kind of gape-mouthed consumer of the stuff. Anyway, between...
How would they differ? Just tell us.
Oh, how would... pretty much along the lines, at least it would be consonant with what I was talking about. For example, probably one of the more famous of these feminist pornographers is called Tristan Taormino. And she describes her practice as, first of all, the working conditions are, as she says, sort of like fair trade organic. And then also, as far as what's actually represented, she says that she doesn't script her actors. She gets to know them. She gets to know their preferences, and she sort of lets them kind of improvise along their own what they feel like doing with each other. That's the best description I can offer. But she's struggling. She's not a billionaire, and you can't see her stuff for free. So if those are the alternatives, what's called feminist pornography or censorship, I would love to know a better one than the one I offered. I just haven't come up with it yet. If you can help me, I would be grateful.
The microphone's...
Thank you very much. I'm going to stand so I can see you. I have a really short two-part question for Alliston. The first, I thought I was talking about yeah.
No worries. My last name is Alliston.
Okay, April. I'm really sorry. Okay, so two parts really short. So
very brief.
Very brief. So first part is about the political project. So I feel that there is a political project here. I'm just not sure that the problem is that girls are giving blowjobs and boys are talking about rape. Because I have a feeling they were doing that before time. And they're definitely doing that in the Soviet Union where they were. But I think there is a political project, and that goes to the second part, which is what about the filth? See, because I think when you're talking about the filthy, like not like the filthy porn. So there's definitely censorship of internet porn, but besides erotic, there's also the filthy, right? Which I think is that which you cannot think, and it's always historically contingent. So late 19th century, we get eroticized nuns. Then we get like colonial imagery and like masochism. We get Tom of Finland, cops doing nasty things. Now I think it's like smoking and fatness, which is really interesting. And bug chasing with gay men. And what do you do with that? Thank you very much.
Okay, Doc, right next to him, and that's it, and then yeah.
So this is for April, but I think there's a
very quickly.
Masochism. If you tell the story not through Sad, but through Sacher Masoch, then you have a different account of consent, a different account of contractualism, and of some individual's experience that might be useful. So that was a statement rather than a question. Accepted as a question as well.
Thank you for being so.
Okay, about masochism, Jack, you spared me by saying that wasn't actually a question. But I guess I would just say, maybe, I had my little footnote about BDSM sexual practice, and maybe that comes really more out of masochism than Saad himself. But I think it's, which maybe would address what your point, in that it's all about defining the lines of consent, which I think is sort of the opposite of what pornography in general tends to do. But the reason I focus on Saad is because most of the discourse surrounding pornography has to do with freedom. Freedom of speech, sexual freedom, and I think that logic comes out of Saad's pushing to its extreme this whole liberal system in which liberty and equality are necessarily in conflict, and where property, the use of property, is implicated in that conflict. As for the other question, two things. So, whether that's interesting to me that girls give blowjobs in school restrooms in the Soviet Union and there's no pornography. I'm not sure what to do with that, because it certainly at least wasn't as prevalent in the U.S. before the era of internet porn. There's a couple of sources on the effects of porn culture on adolescent girls in our American world that I can point you to. One is a documentary film called Pretty Baby, and another one is a recent article published in the online version of Vanity Fair by Nancy Jo Sales. So as far as a connection between porn culture and that kind of behavior, I would refer you to those. As for the filth, something I wasn't able to get into in this paper is that I also think that pornography in general is about grotesquity. It's a kind of grotesque fetish that is used in a kind of game of keep away, where access to sexual power and knowledge is involved in secreting away this grotesque fetish, but doing so as an open secret from those who are meant to feel excluded by the game of keep away. That would be my best answer to what filth is doing in pornography. It's about it functioning as a grotesque fetish.
So on that note.